In today's lecture, I want to talk about one of the most influential theatrical forms to come out of this era. That, of course, is the Commedia dell'Arte. Um, Commedia was an improvisational comedy. It appeared in Italy, but it was popular all over continental Europe. And so today we want to talk about some of the characteristics of Commedia, the characters of Commedia, and what we know about the history of Commedia. First, I want to talk about the meaning of the word Commedia. I think there is a misconception that Commedia automatically implies the word comedy, and Commedia is more appropriately the word for performed theater. And so Commedia dell'Arte is theater of the artists as opposed to Commedia erudita, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But I wanted to dispel that before we went any further. Commedia doesn't always refer to comedy. There were two distinct strains of Commedia that developed in Italy during the Renaissance. There was private theater performed at court and at colleges for the scholars, the courtiers, the nobles, the erudite of Italy, and it was referred to as Commedia erudita. The other was a public theater, a professional theater, and it was called by many names, Commedia all'improvviso, Commedia a soggetto, and most famously, Commedia dell'Arte. Now, the biggest distinction is the private versus public and the nature of the audiences. Just like the private theaters of Elizabethan England catered to an upper-class audience, a noble audience, the Commedia erudita was intended for well-educated Italian audiences. The Commedia dell'Arte, or any of the other names it went by, was a public entertainment. It was meant for mass consumption. We don't know a lot about the origins of Commedia. We know that the first professional contract dates to around 1554, and it appears to be a Commedia contract. As was pointed out in one of the journal articles we read for this module, that is smack dab in the middle of the Council of Trent. The first clear historical reference we have to the Commedia is 1568. So it is clearly a Renaissance creation. Likewise, we know very little about the origins of the Commedia. It does seem very similar to the Italian farces that existed in the early Roman era because of the similarity of stock characters. It bears some resemblance to Byzantine mime that came from the Eastern Roman Empire. It has some semblance to Italian farce. But whatever the source, we know by 1600, Commedia Troupes had spread throughout continental Europe. There are two fundamental characteristics of the Commedia dell'Arte. First of all, it is improvisational. It was done without a fully realized script. It was performed by means of a scenario, a story outline that the performers then filled in as they went. And secondly, it made use of stock characters. There are certain characters that appear in all of the Commedia scenarios that appeared again and again and again in the different Commedia companies that toured throughout Europe. Because the Commedia was an unscripted or non-literary form, a lot of what we know about the Commedia is conjecture. We do have certain published scenarios that came from later in the history of the Commedia. Flaminia Scala, one of the great producers of Commedia, published several of these in the late 1600s. And so most of what we know is supposition and conjecture. First of all, as we look at the improvisational nature of Commedia, we're not sure how improvisational the Commedia was. But let's examine the things that we do know. First, we know that each actor in the company played the same role throughout their career. Unless they came in as a younger actor, they would then change their line of business as they got older, move from one of the young lovers to one of the servants or to one of the masters as they got older. But they played the same role for years in their career. And so I think it's very likely to assume that there were certain bits of dialogue, certain monologues, certain lines that became a part of each actor's stock and trade. It's like, this is one of the sugar stick things that I pull out whenever I want to get a laugh. And so I think it's safe to assume that since these actors played these roles over and over and over again over the course of their career, that certain things became codified as part of their line repertory. That there were standardized bits of stage business that were called lazzi, and that the lazzi were perfected by the actors and used over and over and over again. And you'll see a reference in a commedia scenario to two actors do the hat lazzi. And so we are assuming these were tricky bits of stage business involving props or choreographed movement that were surefire audience favorites. We'll throw them in wherever we can. And again, this seems to some extent, diminish the improvisational character of what they were doing in the Commedia. So from examining the extant scenarios, that each scene or each segment of the scenario would end with a rhymed couplet. And so it's safe to assume that actors weren't expected to come up with rhyme couplets out of thin air. And so, again, these parts of the script were probably memorized. We know that many of the actors kept journals in which they recorded lines that they thought they might be able to use later in their performances, something they heard in actual conversation or some creative witticism that they came up with but they wanted to remember to use in some performance. There are also scraps of song that were recorded in these journals, particularly by the young lovers, so that they could be pulled as needed to go into a scenario or a storyline. So we have these four elements that seem to take away from the improvisational quality of the Commedia. First of all, actors repeated roles for years on end. No doubt they had codified learned lines. There were standardized lazzi. There were the rhyming couplets at the end of each scene, and there were the journals that actors kept to record future possible material to be used on stage. And it was a scenario. It was unscripted. The actors on stage never knew what their partner or adversary on stage was going to say. And so despite all of these things that were possibly memorized or scripted, there is that unescapable improvisational nature that is still there. If you've ever seen any of the great Carol Burnett sketches where you see Tim Conway or Carol Burnett or other members of the company up on stage in what no doubt was a scripted sketch, and yet it's clear that the people on stage are riffing. They're just kind of playing it by ear, and unexpected things happen. Imagine how much more unexpected it would be if they were working just from a scenario, if they were working just from an outline of the story with no clear indication of what each actor was going to say. As I said earlier, we have lots of Commedia scenarios that have survived, over 1,000. Many of these were published by Flaminia Scala in the 1600s. And yes, most of them are comic. and so fit with that preconceived idea that I addressed earlier, that commedia is comedy. But here's where we run into the contradiction. Some of the scenarios are serious sketches. Some of them are melodramas. And so commedia wasn't always just comedy. Commedia doesn't mean comedy, it means theater. And so we need to be aware that they weren't just doing slapstick comedy. There were melodramas with heroes and villains. There were serious stories with sad endings. Using these same characters that we've come to know over and over through theater history and other examples of viewing the commedia. The other thing that has distinguished the Commedia dell'Arte, and which is perhaps the most important convention of the commedia, is the use of stock characters. The use of characters over and over and over again across all companies, across all scenarios. And so I want to take a time now to look at the nature of these commedia stock characters. Of the commedia fall into two primary categories. Those are the masked characters and the unmasked characters. We're going to first look at the masked characters. These characters fall into an additional two categories: masters and servants. First, I want to look at the masters. The masters included three characters. The principal character is Pantalone. We'll look at each of these individually. Pantalone is here in the center. Then Dottore on the left and Capitano on the right. Along with the servant Harlequino, Pantalone is probably the most famous of the commedia characters. He was an old man, a merchant, with a libido and high drive in many cases, and carried certain known characteristics that were repeated from company to company. First, he was always a middle-aged or elderly merchant. In the Italian world, Venice was the heart of the mercantile world, the world of trade and commerce, and so Pantalone always spoke in a Venetian dialect. He always spoke proverbs and aphorisms, and although a middle or older age character, he often competed for the love of the younger women. This speaks back to Scranton's definition of a dramatic comedy, because this pairing of the old with the young woman, the old man with the young woman, is clearly a case of societal crisis. Young lovers are supposed to be together. Old men are not supposed to marry young women. Young women are supposed to marry young men and carry on the line. And so this is a depiction of a society in chaos. And so the scenarios of the commedia often dealt with Pantalone getting his comeuppance with the aid of the zanies or servants, helping the young lovers get together. Pantalone also dressed like a comfortable older merchant. He wore tight-fitting red pantaloons, that's where his name comes from, and red waistcoat. He would wear a vest, soft slippers, black ankle-length coat, a cap, and a mask with a long, wispy gray beard. These became the characteristic trademarks of his character. The second of the master figures is Dottore. Dottore was usually Pantalone's friend, although in some scenarios or stories he is a rival. He is typically a doctor of law or of medicine teaching at one of the great universities, and since Bologna was the chief university center of Italy, Dottore always spoke with a Bolognese accent. He loved to show off his learning, but was not so great in common sense. He was very learned in areas of academia, but when it came to the day-to-day struggles of normal life, he was not a very bright man. His costume was always the black academic gown and cap, and he would always wear a black half mask. He's also often depicted in the stories as a jealous husband or even a cuckold. And again, we're looking at a society in crisis. And, we have these impotent old men who are struggling often to get the attention of the younger women. And that's not normative for society. The master character is Capitano. Now, Capitano made his first appearances in the early Commedia as one of the young lovers, but was eventually graduated up to one of the master characters. He is the typical braggart soldier, the miles glorioso. And his costume indicates that. He always wears a sword, always a cape, a flamboyant hat with a big feather. His nose, the mask usually had a large flamboyant nose and mustache. And he was often given names like Cockatrice or Cockatiel. Not Cockatiel, I made that up. But Cockatrice does come from the scenarios. He was a ultra-masculine, macho character who underneath was all show, and he was a fake. He was a braggart soldier. He was often shown to be actually a coward when it came down to confrontation with any kind of enemy. If he ever drew his sword, it wasn't the long, impressive sword that was implied by the size of his scabbard, but a small, insignificant blade. As I've said, these master characters really point out the nature of dramatic comedy as explained by Scranton in his article in the journal we read. They represent an older order of society. They represent a way that is past, a generation that has become obsolete. And it's important that the younger generation go off on their own, that they aren't tied, aren't encumbered with these older characters who have passed their prime and who have passed their peak of power. The other masked characters of the Commedia were the servants, who are also called the Zanni. And our word zany comes from that word zany, the description of the Italian word for these slapstick comedians who become the partners in crime of the young lovers as they try to outwit, outsmart, outthink the older characters in the play. As you saw in the slide that preceded this bit of video, there were a number of servants in the Commedia. There was Pedrolino, there was Pulcinella, there was Brigela. But without question, the two most important servants were Arlecchino and his female counterpoint, Colombina. Arlecchino, or Harlequin, as he's known in the English, is the mixture of cunning and stupidity. He's the fool trickster. He has appeared in literature in different forms for eternity. From in every culture has that trickster character. He now typically wears a costume that is covered with diamond-shaped patches. Originally, they were real patches covering up holes in his clothing, but it conventionalized over the centuries to become the diamond pattern that we have today. Other related characters that we find in literature are Trufaldino or Trivellino, but Arlecchino is a universal character, and as such can be found throughout the literary world. Columbina, or Arlecchina, is the female counterpart to Arlecchino. She often appears in the same scripts with him. She rarely wears a mask. Harlequin or Arlecchino always wears a black half mask, but Arlecchina or Columbino rarely wear the domino mask. She is a female servant, or fantesca. She's wily, mischievous, and often the confidant to the female lover in the play. The other characters in the Commedia, the unmasked characters, were the young lovers. Inamorato, if it was a male character, or inamorata, if it was female. Most Commedia companies had two pair of young lovers, and these characters were the ones who were encouraged to keep a journal in which they could write down bits of love poetry they heard, or sweet little sayings that could be incorporated into their performances. The young lovers could play all kinds of, could be depicted in all kinds of different ways. There could be the not so bright young lovers, the clever and beautiful young lovers, the young lovers who are helpless in the grips of their father's oppressive ways. There were all kinds of ways these characters could be played, but the important thing was they were always there. And they were always in competition with the older characters, the old men, and they were always helped by the servants or zanni. Commedia companies typically consisted of 10 to 12 actors. Those would include two sets of lovers, a servant girl, a couple of male servants, then a capitano, a dottore, a pantalone. If you count, that gives you 10. Now, there could be variants. There could be more, there could be less, but this was the average size of the Commedia company. Commedia companies made their living traveling, and so these were nomadic theater people. They would travel from city to city performing. They performed in rented halls. They performed in outside stages. They performed in market squares. They performed outside the village in a little clearing. Wherever they could find a place to set up, that's where they would perform. They were the epitome of adaptable. When perspective scenery was available, they would take advantage of it. When there was nothing, they would perform on a bare wooden stage. There were a number of Commedia troupes. The troupe of Alberto Nocelli, the Gelosi or Zealous troupe led by Francesco Andreini and his wife Isabella, the Confidenti troupe, which included Flaminia Scala, the person who published many of the scenarios that we have now, the Desiosi troupe, the Accessi troupe, the Fedeli troupe, and more and more and more and more. There were literally hundreds of these troupes that performed across Europe throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Commedia dell'Arte continued until around 1775, but it reached its peak around 1650 and never again enjoyed the popularity that it had at that point. Although it was most popular in Italy, it was also received in France, Spain, Austria, and basically all over continental Europe. It became one of the most influential theater forms that ever graced the stage. And we still feel the effects of Commedia whenever we see a character that is derived from some kind of stock character, or whenever we see an improv troupe, we are seeing the descendants of Arlecchino and Pantalone on the stage again.